How has everything gone so wrong, so breathtakingly fast? And by wrong, I'm primarily talking about our culture, but of course, that includes what's going on inside of our Catholic Church as well. And to break all of this down for us is a new guest to the Art of Catholic podcast named Noelle Mering, who I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. But first of all, welcome to the Art of Catholic. I'm Matthew Leonard, and I would like to, first of all, thank my patrons at patreon.com who make this possible. You guys are awesome. If you'd like to join them and help me get this podcast out and spread the Catholic faith to people all over the world, I'd appreciate it. You can do that at patreon.com / Matthew Leonard. And you can get Science of Sainthood memberships and free books and things like that over there. So please, if you would, help me out. And also, you can do that by subscribing to the show and sharing it. That is very helpful. And I also want to tell you that I think after listening to today's conversation, you're going to want to do that. So you might as well just do it now. But let me introduce to you my guest. Noelle Mering is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and she's also the co-author of Theology of Home, Parts 1 and 2. She's a frequent contributor for National Catholic Register, The American Mind, The Federalist, Catholic World Report. She does a lot of writing. She's also an editor at theologyofhome.com, and she lives in the Soviet Union, which some people call Southern California, with her husband and children. But she is also the author of a fantastic book. Let's see if I can get this on here appropriately, called Awake Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. And when I say fantastic, I really mean it. I love this book. I have notes all through it. You can see all the dog ears in here. It's opened my eyes on so many levels, and so I'm very happy to have Noelle on to discuss it. So Noelle, welcome to the Art of Catholic.
It's such a fun and honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know, you and I were talking in emails back and forth. I was introduced to you by Carrie Gress, whom I know is your buddy and your co-author of Theology of Home. And I've known Carrie since graduate school, and I've had her on the podcast several times. And along with my buddy Michael Miller, they both said, you have to have Noelle on this podcast. And I say that I was introduced to you, but in our email discussions, it came out, you told me that you were actually at my confirmation party when I first came back into the church back in 1998, which is, it was going way, way back. So it's great to reconnect with you. And I have a great deal of respect for what you and Carrie are doing at Theology of Home.
Oh, thank you. Likewise, we love the Art of Catholic. So yeah, it's so funny. I mean, I remember so distinctly being at your party, but I don't know that we ever had a conversation, and you were just Michael's good friend, and we were excited that you came into the church. So,
well, you know, to be honest, as I was telling you before, I was in kind of a fog when I became Catholic, and it was difficult to process everything that was going on. But it is wonderful to be where we are in the Catholic faith. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a convert as well, right?
I'm actually a revert. I went to a Protestant
Revert.
evangelical college and kind of left the faith for a while, and then I came back. And my husband is actually a convert. He was raised evangelical Episcopalian, funnily enough. So, yeah,
Okay,
so
well,
I
that
feel
was
a
my
bit like a convert.
Yeah, you act like one, so you've got the zeal.
That's a compliment,
which I love.
I know.
No, it is. I mean, sometimes I get a little tired of people elevating converts like we're something special. And to be honest, I always say that cradle Catholics are the most blessed people on the face of the earth because they've had this all from the get-go. And so we're here because of the grace of God and nothing else. And there are actually a lot of converts and potential converts who watch this podcast or listen to it. And so it's always fun to get the emails from them and be able to speak their language at times. And you know, speaking of language, let's dive into this book because the title of the book obviously tells you what it's about. It's about the woke movement. And what I would like you to do is just kind of define what woke is to us right off the top and why this is such an important topic, because we all hear the word ad nauseum, but what is it really in kind of its essence so that we're all on the same page?
Yeah, no, it's important to start with that definition. So I think the most neutral way to define it would be to say that to be woke is to be alert and attuned to the various layers of oppression in society. It started with regard specifically to racism, but it's since broadened to include other areas of oppression in the hot button issues, so gender, with feminism, sexuality, issues of homosexuality, transgenderism, all these things. But it is in a less neutral way of interpreting it. It really is, I think, historically the latest version of a form of Marxism presently on display, whereas Marx was sort of economically focused. This is broadened into finding further areas of division within society beyond just economic and class differences.
All right, well, let's talk about that for a second because it's shocking how many people don't even know who Marx is. So, give us a 30-second bio of who Karl Marx is, and what he's famous for, infamous for.
Sure. So he started writing the end of the 1800s. He was a devotee of the philosopher Hegel, who really kind of started the idea of history with a capital H. So when we talk now about are you on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, that really is rooted in Hegel, whether or not we know it. And it's this idea that we are constantly as a society revolutionizing and through our revolutions, we are coming to a new consciousness as a society until we achieve finally a certain type of utopia or perfect state. And Marx really galvanized on that kind of framework, which you call the Hegelian dialectic. And he said, okay, well, we have to see what the revolution is about now, what we should be revolutionizing, and it should be based on economic disparity. So he defines human beings into division. Every person is either an oppressor or an oppressed. And he developed his own legion of fans and devotees. And after World War I, he had predicted that this revolution of the proletariat against the ruling class was inevitable. However, it didn't come to pass. And so there were a group of German Marxists who were trying to figure out why this didn't happen. And they formed an institute called the Institute for Social Research, which came to be known as the Frankfurt School. And the whole point of this institute was to understand how did the revolution not come to pass and what can we do to seed revolution in the West.
So getting back to Hegel real quick, so the Hegelian dialectic that you referenced is thesis and antithesis, and then they kind of smash into each other, and out of this comes synthesis, right? So it's really
Yes.
it's a philosophy of conflict, basically.
Yes.
Like almost perpetual conflict in a sense, which is really kind of at the heart of the entire woke movement. Am I wrong?
No, that's absolutely right. So it's the idea that you're going to have internal contradictions within any thesis, and then the antithesis is the working out the conflict of those two conflicting elements, and then what comes after that conflict is the new synthesis, which then becomes the new thesis, and then there becomes a new antithesis, and so it's this idea that there's going to be constant roiling conflict periodically in order to come to the correct state of mind.
So what did Marx famously say about religion, and why was this a problem for him?
Yeah, that's an important question. So he really identified two main obstacles to the revolution. And the two were the religion, which he famously called the opiate of the masses, and also the family. Why? Because religion, in particular, as we'll talk in a Christian context, Christianity gives you a real context for your suffering. So if you've got hardships in your day, in your life, in your state of life, you have a context in which to place those hardships. You have a way in which your suffering can be ennobling, and also, sanctifying. And so you adapt to your suffering in a way. And that really is an enemy to revolution, because a correct consciousness, a revolutionary consciousness, can never place suffering in a context that helps it make sense. It always has to be something that is frustrating and oppressing their freedom. And so the revolution needs people who are aware of that fundamental injustice, fundamental oppression, and angry enough to galvanize against it and revolt against it. So religion he correctly identified as an enemy. He also said the family is. Why? Because there are multiple ways in which the family is an introduction for the person, the human being, for one, particularly in a Christian context, into the love of God. Right? We understand our personhood, our irreplaceability, and a sense of true authority and right authority through the context of the family life, and the idea concept of authority, which we can get into later, is really an enemy also to revolution. And so the family structure being sort of implicitly a hierarchy, parents to children, in a loving way, not in a domineering way, in a well-ordered family, really is an enemy to that sort of flattening of society and elevation of the party, the government, as being the only kind of power that be, rather than something that transcends this world. So he one of the ways he and Engels would write about the family life in particular was that we had to encourage men to become tomcats, as they would say in their that sort of the vernacular of the day, which is to encourage men to become licentious. Why? Because a licentious man creates a calloused and cynical and distrustful woman and rebellious children. And this serves the cause of revolution well. Revolution is not made from a society of whole, healthy human beings. It's made from a society of social pathologies. That becomes a fertile ground for revolution when people are not having that sort of self-autonomy that a family provides them, but rather they need the community of the state, the community of the government, to aid their lives and to help raise the children and all of these things. And also to, eventually, as we see later, the Frankfurt School, that those sort of social pathologies make you really hurt and wounded. And then someone who's wounded is more primed to be someone who's angry.
So having to deal with suffering and having to deal with the family structure. And when I read this in your book, it struck me that it would seem that Catholicism would play a particularly difficult role for them, just because of the view that we have of redemptive suffering, right? So this is a very different theology than I was raised with as a Protestant, and you paint with a very broad brush when you're talking about Protestantism, but suffering in some of the places where I was, you were trying to avoid it, or if you had it, that means you didn't have enough faith or whatever. But for Catholics, we have this idea that suffering actually makes us just like Jesus Christ. So he's going to have to deal with that, which is what you were talking about. And the family life thing, I mean, obviously, we are made for the divine family of God, and attacks by the evil one at the family is really an attack on a Trinitarian community of persons, as John Paul II and so many others have talked about. Why is it, though, that, get into this a little bit more. Why is sexual promiscuity, why does it go hand in hand with revolution?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think part of the essential things to understand is that every time there is a kind of communist ideology or something of that sort, or ideology in general, it has to become coercive and forceful. And why? Because I think, at its core, it has to assume that there's no stable human nature, that we are kind of social constructs and we can be remade according to the vision of the ideology. So sexual revolution really serves that purpose well, because it begins to bifurcate us both in our souls, but also bifurcate us from our embodied nature. For example, during the sexual revolution, if you're talking about sexual revolution, one of the things I always say is, they talk about it as though our bodies are just an instrument, right? That we're just ghosts in a machine, or, whatever analogy you want to use. But we know so deeply that that's not true. Any woman who has experienced, some sort of sexual injustice or assault, or, something experienced, the hookup culture where you feel used, even if you consented or something. These women know that what was done to their body was done to them, that their body's not something distant from them. And so the sexual revolution, it encourages this sort of, it strips us of a moral vocabulary of which to speak about these types of experiences and these types of wounds. And so what happens then? So you go through this, sort of hookup culture, and you feel used, you feel, hurt, you're not sure why, because you're supposed to be okay with this. It's supposed to be empowering, but actually it makes you feel weaker. Maybe you make a choice to have an abortion or something like that. There's deep senses of hurt and guilt and shame, and there's no context for those experiences, those feelings. And so you end up really going to a place of despair, I think, because you don't know how to articulate or name what is wounding you.
My guess is it also has something to do with the fact, well, it's tied into all of this. You are training people to not deny themselves as well. So you're allowing them to just act on whatever passion it is that they have, and then this becomes a defining thing that makes you who you are, so to speak.
Sure. And also, and you're not able to rule yourself, right? You can't,
Right.
There's no self-mastery and no self-restraint. And a society of individuals who cannot govern themselves becomes a society that has to be governed externally.
Yeah, as John Paul II said, you must first possess yourself before you can give yourself away. And so this is striking right at the heart of that entire idea. All right, so let's back up for just a second here, because the woke movement is an ideology, right? So what define for us what an ideology is and why, particularly in these kinds of ideologies or in ideological movements, that is, the group is what must flourish, not the individual. Why is that the case, and what exactly does that mean?
Okay, well, I'll take the first question first. So an ideology is something that basically points to partial truths or takes some sort of partial truth and then totalizes that partial truth until it reduces the actual truth, if that makes sense. So, for example, if the ideology of the woke movement or the sort of neo-Marxism movement would say that all of reality is filtered through a lens of power. So in every interaction, in every institution, in every dynamic, in my marriage, in my friendships, in government, in corporations, that it's all needs to be seen and understood through the lens of power. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? How can we reverse these power dynamics and invert them? So it takes that one filter, which points at something real, right? There can be power dynamics. There is true injustice. There are people who have been oppressed. These things are true and real. But it takes that one filter and totalizes the filter until that's all you can see any dynamic through. The entire cosmos, and then in that totalizing, the entire cosmos becomes reduced to have to conform and fit into this sort of ideology. And you see this reflected when, for example, Robin DiAngelo says, the question in any situation is not, did racism occur, but it is, how did racism occur? The assumption being that it is omnipresent, right? It sort of deifies the ideology because it becomes everywhere. It becomes an all-powerful, all-present, filter through which we view everything. So, and the second question, a group over person. So I think what happens is that you become important insofar as you serve the ideology. So persons become reduced to totems of the ideology. So and if you don't, and this is an example of how it doesn't actually empower persons; it empowers itself. For example, when there was the 2017 Women's March, there was a group of pro-life feminists who wanted to march, and they were sponsors of the march. And when the organizers found out about this group of pro-life feminists, they said, you can march with us, but you cannot have any official affiliation. And I think it comes down to the fundamental definition of the person for the woke is that you are defined by your oppression. So, for example, for us, the Christian or Catholic, Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person, we are defined by the love of God, right? In relationship to him as sons and daughters. Our divine affiliation is at the core of our being. And that gives us a mission to go and spread this good news to other people that they are loved. And the woke really inverts that. They say you're defined not by the love of God, but by the hatred of society. You're defined by your oppression. And that creates a kind of contra-gospel mission, right? That you're supposed to go out and spread the bad news to people, raise their consciousness to the fact of their oppression. And so, ultimately, the person, even in the groups that they allege to be empowering, women, minorities, racial minorities, the person actually becomes reduced. The woman the pro-life feminists, they are women, but because they're in denial of this fundamental definition, according to the woke, of their oppression, because they're not fighting their oppression on the battlefield of abortion, which is the sort of the sacrament ultimately of the feminist movement, then they are in some ways not fully living out their womanhood. So they are reduced. You see this again when Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project said, there's a difference between being racially Black and being politically Black. So a conservative Black man, in other words, is not fully living out his true identity because he's not supporting the ideology. So it's really not about empowering these people. It's about empowering the people who will be used to further the ideology. It's about the group. It's not about the person.
Yeah, another example I was thinking about was Milo Yiannopoulos, who's same-sex attracted. He's had a conversion to Catholicism, thanks be to God, but he didn't speak for the movement anymore, and he was excised out of it because he didn't recognize the same level of oppression, even though he had those same attractions and was part of that movement in the past. So that's fascinating, and that's why you'll see different people, I guess, popping up at various times as far as leading figures, because as soon as one has been used and their usefulness is over, they get tossed to the side, or if they have a conversion of thought, then they're kicked to the curb as well, and the ideology moves on. You brought it up and you've referenced it a couple of times. Let's talk about critical theory, because most of us have heard about critical race theory, but that's really just kind of an iteration of the underlying idea here. So, what is critical theory? Why is it so diabolical?
Sure. So critical theory came out of the Frankfurt School. And it's the idea, the fundamental difference between, I think a lot of times we confuse it with critical thinking, or one person will be trying to do critical thinking and the other person's doing, their interlocutor is doing critical theory, and they just can't understand why, they can't can't connect in their argument. Critical thinking, classical critical thinking, is oriented towards the truth. Truth is the goal. And so what does that mean? That means you invite objections, you invite criticism, because you're trying to arrive at the truth. So you're trying to strengthen your argument. You're trying to steel man yourself. Steel manning is the opposite of straw manning. Straw manning, you want to engage the worst possible argument of your opponent. Steel manning, you're trying to engage the strongest possible argument, because you want to feel confident that you have arrived at the truth, or if you haven't, you want to correct that. So critical theory has not truth as its end, but power. So the truth, this is kind of the postmodern element coming in that brought this in, that truth becomes a function of power, meaning that there is no actual objective truth that we can know or that's knowable to us, or some people would say that even exists. So what we're trying to do is so the point of argument is not to arrive at truth; it's to arrive at power. Activism is the goal. So you're trying to churn out activists, not to churn out true thinkers. So with that goal? That change in goals means there's going to be a totally different methodology. So rather than invite criticism, the critical theorist does not invite criticism. Actually, in their writing, in their literature, they believe in silencing criticism. So they don't invite criticism, but their whole method is to hand out criticism. So the critical theorist wants to criticize all that is. That is the point. Whatever is the status quo, you criticize it.
Well, and this is kind of one of the most infuriating things that we see in modern culture, and a lot of people have pointed this out many times. But in the kind of cancel culture world that we live in, tolerance is a one-way street. And what you're saying is that while you're speaking about tolerance from the woke perspective, they're not allowing it on the other side, and they're repressing that actively. And why is that? Is it because they believe that their cause is so just, and so they have a right to do that? Or what's at the foundation of that?
Yeah, so the foundation of that was really from an important, really pivotal essay in the 60s by Herbert Marcuse, who was a sort of celebrity intellectual from the Frankfurt School. And it was called Repressive Tolerance. And the whole point of it was that there is sort of a dominant way, powerful establishment in all institutions of culture that kind of maintains a status quo of the old guard, sort of traditional values, a moral law, a capitalist system. And because they are dominant, the goal of the activist is not to give equal hearing to both sides in any sort of debate, but rather to silence those dominant voices. And so to give an equal ear hearing to someone who represents something that is traditional, or objective or capitalist, is to further the power structure that already is. And the goal of inverting that power structure means that they should not be given equal ear. They should be actually repressed. They should be silenced.
So let's pivot for a second to the progressive kind of woke problem with natural law here, because I found this to be a really fascinating section of the book. And again, the book we're talking about is Awake, Not Woke, Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. Just, again, you got to get this book. It's by TAM Publishers. It's really, really fascinating. And what we're talking about here is really just kind of scratching the surface of what you deal with in here, Noelle, and it's fantastic. So let's pivot to the progressive movement's problem with natural law, because I'll just turn it over to you. Why don't you define for us very quickly what natural law is and why it's a problem for the progressive movement?
Sure. So natural law basically means that there's an intelligibility to the things to our bodily reality, and to nature in general, to concrete thing, the concrete world. And that intelligible reality implies that there's an end, there's a purpose to things, there's a telos. So this is where people oftentimes will talk about the church's teaching about contraception in this context, that, we have reproductive organs, that sex has an end, that, there's all sorts of analogies. People say, you don't put sand into a gas tank in order to get the car to move. You have to work with things in harmony with their nature if you want them to flourish. Um, but it also means that there's an objective meaning to our bodies and to there's a stability to human nature. And this is a indirect opposition to what the woke movements say. So this is, if we're kind of moving through what I identify as three kind of fundamental dogmas of the movement. The first one is group over person, and this one falls under human will over reason or human nature. And it's the implication of natural law, obviously, is that it's grounded in a higher law, that there's a higher law to be had, a moral law. So this is when you see Martin Luther King Jr. talk about in his letter to the Birmingham jail that there is a way in which we can evaluate human law in the context of a higher law that transcends it. And we can gauge and understand whether or not it conforms to a higher law or if it's in opposition. And the revolution really wants to do away with that whole concept of that sort of moral law and hierarchy.
And is that because basically they view that whole idea that we're moving toward a natural end and things have an intelligibility because it represses their freedom to express themselves or to define who it is they are?
Yeah, so what we would call this, the Frankfurt School had neo-Marxism, but it also had a real neo-Freudian element to it. And this second dogma, you really see that neo-Freudianism come to bear. So basically, we would call it now expressive individualism, for example, I think is the most popular way to term it, this ideology. And what it means basically is that we are oppressed not just by groups outside of ourselves, we're actually internally repressed. We oppress ourselves by feeling that we have to conform our desires to some sort of objective moral norms. So part of the process of our liberation is they would say, for expressive individualism, it's three fundamental virtues: expression, authenticity, and liberation. So the idea being individuality, authenticity, and liberation. So the idea being that we have to identify what our deep desires are, particularly in the areas of sexual desires. And the ones that are most transgressive are the ones that are most going to free us. So the more transgressive we can identify in ourselves, or more transgressive desire we can find in ourselves, and then living it out, the greater opportunity for liberation and freedom we have. So this is sort of why we see, like at Pride parades, there's a kind of it almost seems like a competition for the most outlandish presentation of self, because the more you can expose some sort of transgressive element of yourself, then the more you're bucking the power of a moral law in society in general.
Where do you end up? I mean, that's the thing that I don't understand. I mean, from a big, backing out perspective, if you have this constant fighting against whatever oppression is there, you're fighting against the power. Eventually, then, if you fight well enough, you become the power, and then you're being fought against by others. And this goes back to the Hegelian dialectic that we were talking about previously. But what's the end of all this? So what do you do? How do you even find your liberation? If you're oppressed from the outside, you're oppressed from the inside. How do you know when you're even yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if we look at history, where you end is you end up a slave, right? The people who are empowered, and whenever this ideology is implemented, it becomes this rarefied few leaders who, turn on each other, violently, ultimately, until, there's just this cult of personality of this one person living in a mansion, and everyone else has, been reduced. So, it's not, the peasants never truly become the rulers, even, in the fury of a revolt. Everyone winds up suffering. And so that's why this is, and we see this time and again, and they'll say, it just wasn't implemented well enough, or it just wasn't implemented accurately. It's not true. It's just because it's an impossible ideology. And it ultimately ends in violence. There's a reason why we have the Me Too movement is connected to sexual freedom, right? Because if you teach people to become these sort of godlike figures who can do whatever they will, and that there's no meaning to the body, there's nothing to reverence, the only thing that's going to restrain you is this kind of sermon, like corporate idea of consent, just sign a contract. As long as you do that, then you can do whatever you want. Well, that's going to end up in a violent society, because this little thin piece of paper of consent is not enough to restrain people who cannot restrain themselves and who have been taught that their bodies have no meaning and that the other person's body has no meaning. Because once I start to instrumentalize myself, I'm going to instrumentalize the body of another. And so I think intrinsically the ideology leads towards this sort of weakening and violence in society.
Which would lead to just depression and despair, and it's just a spiraling downward. I mean, how do you even get out of that once you go down that road? Obviously through Christianity, through Jesus, but from a worldly perspective, there's no way out.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It feels diabolical in how smart it is and if how effective it is, right? Because once you go down this spiral, you really become. It really feeds into itself. You start to feel the more wounded you are, the more primed for anger you are because you feel really helpless. And I think that ideology fundamentally takes away agency from the individual utterly. Everything is the power. Everything in your life becomes at the mercy of systemic forces outside of yourself. So your failures are not yours to own. Your successes are not yours to claim. Um, and that's not to say that there aren't ways in which things are our agency is mitigated from things that we cannot control. Certainly there is, but any empowering message that we give to people in any other context, leadership and business and any other context, the first thing you always say, spiritual mentorship, is take responsibility. What can you take responsibility for in your life, and then lean into that, and then because if you become this person who is at the mercy of all your circumstances, you're never going to move beyond them, right? And so really it's a message of despair. I think if it makes people feel helpless, and then the helpless person quickly moves into anger, um, because it's really frustrating. You cannot stay in that sort of helpless place for very long. But even the idea of one things I talk about a lot is that the idea that started in the sexual revolution and now we see in transgenderism even more acutely is that our bodies have no meaning means that we have no meaning, and even in that level, I think that people sort of understand that on some level, that if they're acting in accordance with this ideology that tells them that their body is meaningless, then they know in some way that they don't really matter. They're meaningless themselves.
Yeah, it occurs to me that one of the diabolical features of this, if you're getting rid of this body soul unity that we have, right? We're embodied persons. That when you kind of play this out all the way down the road, this movement where our bodies have no meaning is fundamentally opposed then and denudes the incarnation of Jesus Christ of any value, and it no
Yes.
longer becomes the focal point of God's plan to redeem us.
Absolutely. And I mean, and that's why the incarnation is so powerful. It's because it's acknowledging the importance and the dignity of the person in an embodied way.
Why is it? And you mentioned a few minutes ago this section about will over reason, and there was another part of this that I found fascinating. Why is it that when they're seeking to deconstruct human nature, that it only applies, the activities only apply to certain categories of oppression and not to everything? So, for example, you see an attempt to kind of blur the lines between male and female, but at the same time, you don't blur the lines between color. You want to amplify them. Why is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important. It's such an interesting distinction, and people make jokes about it a lot now. And that can I identify as a different race? And that's very verboten. And you see, even when people who are very sympathetic to the ideology have done it. That woman Rachel Doe, I can't remember her name, started with a D, but she was identified as a black person, and she was running the NAACP chapter in some place, and it came out that she wasn't. And anyway, and she was totally shamed. It was such a bizarre. But you can utterly do that with your sex, right? So the reason I think is that the differences between the sexes, man and women, implies a difference in behavior, right? There are certain implications that come from that we are supposed to treat each other differently. The way I can be with my female friends is not the way I would be with my male friends. It would, with that, there's a sort of intimacy that I can have in female friendships that I can't in male friendships, and that's appropriate. But even just in more concrete things like having men and women's locker rooms, or the in restrooms and stuff, there's a propriety there, because to erase those boundaries is to start. You lose a reverence for the woman, and in particular, and I think that is important. Is that those distinctions help us to have that appropriate reverence for one another, but also for what traditionally women, there is a particular reverence owed to her, because she can bear life, because she is a protector in some ways of virtue. I'm speaking in broad brush ways, but but that men are called to protect that treasure, that beauty. And whereas in the racial distinctions do not imply any sort of difference in behavior, right? I mean, I can be just as close with a woman of a different race than I can be with a woman of my own race. And I am actually biracial, for the record. My mother is born from the Philippines, and my father is white. But there's no difference in behavior that is implied in those distinctions. And so in eradicating the differences with men and women and amplifying the differences between the races, you create starker and broader groups of lines of enemy lines, because men and women it erodes the friendship of men and women to reject those boundaries. And it also erodes the friendship between the races to amplify those boundaries. Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to go back. I have so many questions pop around in my head. There's so much to talk about in this book, guys. I found it fascinating. You open the entire book with a chapter called Ye Shall Be as Gods, because at the heart of all of this is this unnamed desire for every one of us to be divine, right? We're made to be deified. That was the temptation that Adam faced back in the Garden of Eden. And it's what we face constantly. And Adam failed because he wanted it on his own terms, which is really kind of what the woke movement is moving toward. What's what sin really is in its essence. It's self-centered instead of self-giving. Marxism and the underpinning philosophical foundation of the whole woke movement really stokes these fires of self-centeredness, because it's stoking the fires of our individuality, and we want to throw off the shackles of those who oppress us so that we can't achieve that true destiny for which we were made. But really, at the end of the day, it's this desire that we have to be like gods, because that's the way that we were created to be for all eternity, even if we haven't achieved that yet. I mean, I found it really intriguing that you started it all off with the Garden of Eden story, because none of this is anything new.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's always hard to pinpoint in history when a certain movement starts. So I later on started with Marx and Hegel, but I really felt like it was important to start it in the Garden of Eden, just to reference how universal this non-servium is, really. And I think fundamentally it is a non-servium. It's a rejection of the mission to serve, because it's a rejection of reverence. If there's nothing to revere, then there's nothing to serve.
And speaking of revering, I mean, where does fatherhood come into all of this? Is there something about fatherhood that is highly problematic for the progressive movement?
Yeah. So in the third dogma is the elevation of human power in a rejection of authority. And I think fatherhood was such a particular target of the movement. And rightly so, according to their own inner logic, because a father really is sort of, we talked about a bit earlier, but it really is our first experience with what proper authority should be. And people have authority is such a fraught word now, I think, in part because of this ideology, but also because a lot of people have, father wounds, or, for example, or authority has been misappropriated or has been abusive in their experience. But even people who haven't had a good or healthy relationship with a father know sort of what a father ought to have been, right? A father should not be controlling. He should be a moral leader. He should be leading by example. He should be inspiring us because of his discipline, his virtue, his goodness. He should be oriented towards creating us to be freer, right? That we can become our own self-masters, not that we should be dependent upon him. So that's the bad father versus the good father. But we have this understanding of what it ought to be. And it's interesting. I was talking to, I think I write it in the book too, a woman I've known for a long time, a wonderful woman, and she's a grandmother and her husband's a grandfather, and they both grandparent the children the same way, same styles of discipline, same styles of recreation. But she said at one point, it's interesting, when he walks into the room, he has an authority with the children that I don't have. And it's just in, his deeper voice. It's in his commanding presence. It's in, that there is something even written into the body of a man that points to a call to be some sort of signpost towards the fatherhood of God. And that's not to say that women can't be leaders and authority figures and men can't be nurturers. Certainly we're all whole human beings. We can exemplify the whole host and range of the virtues. But there's particular ways in which our sex speaks to some aspect of God that is important, and it's not to be, dismissed with lightly. And I think that's why fatherhood, but also because of what we were saying earlier, that really getting at the father, the moral virtue of the father, erodes trust and love within the family and then within society very quickly. It's such an effective target.
Does the movement then seek to replace the role of father? I mean, because if you don't have a father figure, you're going to look for one. I mean, George Michael sang about it back in the 80s. That'll be your father figure and whatnot. But I mean, if you don't have that, you look for it, right? So does the movement seek to become that, or are they trying to push you towards something else?
Well, I think it's in a way both. So, I think when everyone wants to be in a family. And so if you don't have a good family life or your family's been oppressive, it's not that you just say, well, I'm the type of person who doesn't need a family. You try to replace your family in certain ways. This is what happens with gang, why a gang attracts people is because there's a lot of kids who are looking for strong leaders and they didn't have one in their family life. And so here's this gang and it seems really powerful. But so it's a facsimile of a family, it's trying to recreate that kind of tribe, but it's doing it on an unhealthy way. So it's mimicking it, but it's also a distortion of it. It's built on guilt and it's built on a threat. You have to stay with the family. And I think of a gang as being such an analogy for kind of that sort of toxic tribalism that I think comes from ideology, where it's not oriented towards freedom. It's not oriented towards the dignity of the individual. It's oriented towards the power of the gang, power of the group. Kind of a mob mentality where the person is absorbed into it, but also reduced in his humanity.
And also the initiation techniques that are present in things like gangs, the violence that it begets because the complicity that's amongst the different members. What are you going to identify with? You don't have a natural set of parents. And so you are doing this thing, this violent act, whatever it might be. That makes you a part of us. And that's what it's a weird thing. That's what kind of creates their family culture, so to speak. But it's complicity. It's not familial life. Yeah. It's that you did this thing with us.
Yeah, it's a membership by guilt, right? Membership by complicity. And I think that's an effective way of, compelling someone into your group.
I've even thought about this with regard to silly things like, NFL and things, your sports franchises that you follow and things. And that becomes your identifying factor. And people dress up the way they do and all the rest of it because they want to be a member of that family of people. And it's centered around a game. It always kind of cracks me up.
Yeah.
Now, you talk about different cultures in the book, and you mention the honor culture, the dignity culture, and the victim culture. Would you briefly describe what those are and then kind of tell us where you think we are?
Sure. No, I got that from, there are some sociologists, Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning, who wrote about these three cultures. And I thought it was super fascinating. But so an honor culture would be something like you would think of in the Wild West. Or, Japanese culture, I think, has had a more of an honor culture. So the idea is that your name is really important. Your reputation is really important. And that you do not, it's a sign of dignity, or it's a sign of honor to handle your problems yourself. You don't appeal to third parties. So this is, you're insulted, you have a duel or something like that. And a dignity culture, I think, is the one that would be most closely identifiable to Christian and maybe to people of our generation. So dignity culture is that the understanding that your dignity does not come from your community. It comes from something outside of other people's opinions about you. You receive dignity, by being a daughter or son of God. But it also, it's unlike the honor culture in the sense that it has a real sense of kind of community justice. So you can appeal to the court. If there's an injustice, you don't have to go and shoot the person yourself. This sort of civilization is, appropriate and fine when conflicts arise. And then that's sort of like how we grew up with sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This idea that, you can't actually fundamentally assault who I am. Even if you wound me physically, you can't take away my dignity. So victim culture, you receive, so it depends on the affirmation of the community in order to maintain your dignity. So for example, this is why you see pronouns are so important, because if I'm speaking into reality, who I am, in defiance of my bodily reality, I need you to if I can do that with my words, I need you to maintain it with your words. And your words can actually fundamentally threaten my dignity in that way. A victim culture also finds moral stature in the way that we are harmed. So it creates this perverse incentive for people to kind of scan their environment and find ways in which they might be being oppressed. And if you can't find them, you have to find sort of invisible ways. That's why we get microaggressions. You talk about there's a supply and demand problem. We have such a high demand for injustice now and for ways in which we're victimized. But the supply oftentimes is in certain ways, and maybe in other respects not. But in some certain respects, it's reduced, right? We have blessedly less, racial prejudice and, in certain ways, less misogyny, although in other ways, there's some deep covert misogyny too. Uh, so it makes you have to find, though, there's a high demand for being a victim, though, and so you have to find it in ways that aren't necessarily explicit. Maybe they're systemic, maybe they're micro, who knows. But it creates a society of constant conflict because it's people trying to find their moral status by asserting and publicizing their victimhood. Um, and it also believes not in handling your injustices on your own the way an honor culture does. It actually wants to appeal to third parties. So you have to find your victimhood, publicize it, and then you need everyone else to kind of agree to that you're a victim, fight against it, and join your fight. Become an ally.
Well, I asked you at the beginning of the question, where do you think we are? I think everyone already knows exactly where we are by the way you answered the question. But when you look at the myriad of issues that we are facing, and you recognize that there are these deep philosophical reasons and movements that are pushing this ideology and trying to force us down this path, and they seem to be doing it so very successfully, breathtakingly fast. The last decade has just seen radical shifts on all kinds of levels, even the last 5 years. What do we do? Like, what do we do in order to move forward as Christians and people who are wanting to live rightly and virtuous lives and raise our families? And obviously there are lots of different ways that we're going to have to deal with this on a local level, whether it's in our schools or if it seeps into our churches or whatever. But fundamentally, is there a way to combat this in our individual lives?
Yeah, no, it's a great and big question. I mean, fundamentally, I think it's a spiritual battle, and I go into that a lot, or in a particular way in the book. And so I think we have to wage it on that level first and foremost, right? In our prayer,
Amen.
interior lives of prayer,
Yes.
and staying close to the sacraments, particularly sacrament of confession. I think the confession really is the antidote to the movement. The movement, it disposes you to try to accuse people. It's a movement that grows through accusation, through finding the faults of others. And the church is so wise, just even on a natural level, to prompt us to go to confession regularly, weekly, if possible, because then you're really forced to stop deflecting from your faults and also actually just identify them and not. And in doing that, we become people who are more aware of our need for mercy. And then we become more merciful people, right? Because once we see how much we need mercy, then we are we're less likely to judge the interior life of another, right? We're more likely to excuse it and look on each other with eyes of mercy. And this movement really is a fundamental attack on mercy. And so I think that we have to become people who are united in that way in ourselves, that we're not bifurcated. We see our need for a savior and we seek him out, and then we move throughout the world with those sorts of eyes of love. But fundamentally, I also think that, it is a movement that operates on confusion. It takes Christian precepts, walk with the poor, walk with the marginalized, walk with the suffering, and it manipulates them. It takes those right, good precepts, and then it says, okay, but here's all the ideology you have to accept in order to do that right. If you're going to be an ally for racial injustice, then you have to be an ally in these particular ways, with CRT, with Black Lives Matter. And all these particular ways that are loaded with a whole host of lies that are really fundamentally harmful to people, especially the people they're most claiming to help. So I think we need to be really clear on what's happening and not be taken up by the confusion. And I really see a lot of Christians, and Catholics, and be pulled into aspects of this movement because it is operating on these appeals to compassion that, I think we all want to be compassionate people. So I think the more we understand what's happening, then the more we can have the courage and confidence to fight against it. And I think we should have a lot of confidence because human nature wants to live in accord with itself, right? We want to live in accord with the human nature. We want to be happy. We want to be people who are flourishing. And so that's a universal desire, regardless of whether or not someone, knows who Jesus Christ is yet. They still want to be happy. And so we have all of those tools, all of that is built into our nature and it's built into the truth. It's not going to be that desire is not going to be fulfilled by ideology.
Yeah, going back to what you'd said right off the top, where it's a matter of the interior life. And there's a reason why Jesus says it's the one thing necessary in Luke chapter 10, because it is the one thing necessary. But Benedict XVI will talk about how prayer is the school of hope, and what prayer does, and this is in the words of Augustine as well, is it stretches us to the point where we're able to receive more of the grace of God, and we want God more than anything else. But it fights, Benedict talks about how it is that it fights against despair, and it fights against presumption, and it fights against despair because prayer puts us in this position where we're reminded we're not alone. And so when you feel overwhelmed by the things that you are facing in this world and how it's assaulting your family, pray, because if you pray, you are just more open to the grace of God. And also, the sacraments, but don't forget daily mass. I mean, if you have the ability to get the daily mass, and how do we start our masses off? The Confiteor, through my fault, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. We're recognizing our own inabilities to shape who we are outside of Jesus Christ. And all of this is such an attack on the humility of Jesus Christ, because we, again, as you point out in the very beginning of the book, we're placing ourselves in the role of the divine. And that is fundamentally opposed to what it means to be a Christian. We are a part of him to the degree that we conform ourselves to him. And I guess that's one of the things I always come back to. St. Thomas Aquinas has this great line: truth is conforming one's mind to reality. And that seems to be so much of what this movement just flies in the face of, because they're trying to create their own reality. And it's this constant changing thing. It never arrives anywhere because it has no foundation in anything but yourself. And unless you have your foundation in Jesus Christ, you're always going to be unmoored. And so the deeper your relationship with Jesus Christ, and the more you can conform yourself to him, the less overwhelmed you're going to be in the face of all of these things, even as we continue to fight and try to help our families and our friends. And I guess that's another part of it. You're fighting this battle from a very high level with your books and what you and Carrie are doing and others. And there are other people who are fighting this as well. For most of us, the primary focus is be educated, buy the book, get educated. We've barely scratched the surface of what is in here, guys. I'm telling you. And I know this is kind of like a flyover, and some of you might be like, what the heck are they talking about? It's in here, and it is really, you need to grab this book because it will explain so much of why it is that we are in the situation that we are. But don't forget that even though you have this high level stuff and people fighting these battles at high levels, for us and for most of us, it's working it out in our own families. Mother Teresa says, grow where you are planted. And our fundamental responsibility is to deal with it in ourselves and help this kind of understanding of who we are in Jesus Christ flourish in our own family members. That's primary. And if you do that by strengthening your own family, the more people that do that, the more we fight against the nonsense that's out there, because we're actually helping the family to flourish instead of the ideology, which is what's going to undercut all of this one way or the other.
Beautiful. Amen. Yeah. I mean, I think that if people always ask me, are we going to have to suffer? Like, what's going to happen? Is the country going to be lost? I don't know. I don't know if there'll be a moment where we have to make some grand gesture where we have to, sacrifice. Who knows? But I know how we become the type of people who can make the right choice for Christ if called upon, by making the right choice for him in the small hidden ways of our lives every day.
That's exactly right. You're flexing that muscle that allows you to, when the big moment comes, you're actually prepared to deal with it. And so we have to have lives of self-denial even now. And this is why, penitential offerings of yourself, small mortifications on a daily basis, that constant self-denial, not so that you're miserable, but it's becoming an act of love, whereby you're giving yourself to Jesus Christ and you're giving of yourself toward others. Just thinking about this, if you are, we talked about earlier about how this is all kind of an attack on the incarnation. And by attacking the incarnation, you're really attacking the fundamental idea behind redemptive suffering, as we talked about. Well, you fight against that by offering up redemptive suffering, and you do these mortifications. And by making a gift of your own body in the same way of Jesus Christ, the spiritual benefits and what this does for the overall spiritual warfare, you can't fathom how powerful that is. Because when you deny yourself, you're flying not just in the face of this ideological movement that is coming against us, you're flying in the face of the evil one himself, because he would not serve, and he wanted everything his own way. And we have to have that servant's heart and give of ourselves away instead of trying to take everything for ourselves. That's really the way we fight. You get holy, and that's it in a nutshell. And if you do that, you'll start to see the things, not just in your own life, but in your family life and those around you, start to transform.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to suffer well. And if we don't know how to suffer well, we suffer loudly. And that's because we don't have meaning. There's an intimate connection between suffering and
Mm,
meaning. When you
so
strip people of
true.
meaning, that's the greatest oppression you can inflict on a society, is to take away their understanding of meaning. And if
Yeah,
you don't have meaning, you don't know how to suffer. So
so
you're absolutely
true.
right. We need to know how to suffer well.
This has been fascinating, Noelle, and I really want to thank you for taking the time and coming on again. Awake, Not Woke. Grab this. It's from Tan Books. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you are doing?
Well, I'm an editor with my friend Carrie Gress for theologyofhome.com. We've got an active Instagram presence. I personally am on Twitter, Noelle M, and I've got my personal website with my articles and all of that at noellemering.com.
Okay, that's fantastic. And is there any particular place you guys would like people to purchase the book, or does it matter to you?
Well, we have a shop called theologyofhome.com, so you can purchase the book there, but it's also wherever you buy books.
Got it. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to having you back on again and discussing. I'm hoping new books that you are working on, because this was great, and I think you're doing wonderful work. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. Great to be with you, and God bless you and your work.
Thanks.